Okay, next up we have a dose of reality, overcoming usability challenges in VR head-mounted displays. It's a paper from the School of Computing Science at Glasgow in the UK. And Mark McGill is going to give the talk.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the current resurgence in consumer VR headsets. You've got headsets such as the Gear VR, Oculus Rift EK1 and 2, and Google Cardboard. VR headsets are now reaching into home usage. But there's still an open question as to the usability of these headsets in contexts like the living room. So we performed a survey of 108 current existing VR users, the majority of which were DK1, DK2, Oculus Rift users, in order to see what kind of problems they had with using these headsets. And very briefly, in general, they found that removing the HMD is frustrating, and it happens frequently. Interacting with reality, so peripherals and objects, is difficult, and their awareness of reality, so the presence and proximity of others, is impeded. So we set out to quantify, well, how well can users interact with reality? Can we improve their capability to interact with reality? And can we improve their awareness of reality? So our first study was a typing study. Why a typing study? Well, the keyboard is a commonly used and familiar input device. It can accommodate unsighted use and has easily quantifiable performance metrics. So what we looked at was, well, we had 4 conditions. The reality baseline, so that was just doing a typing study outside of VR headsets with monitor keyboard, and then 3 VR conditions. The first of which, and you can see the interface that they saw through the headset here, was where they had no view of the keyboard or reality. This was essentially typing in the blind. As you see, it's not particularly easy. The next one was a partial blending condition, so that's where they had a view of the keyboard and hands that would come into view when they were looking down. And the last condition was a full blending condition, so that's where they would have the full view of reality when they looked down at the keyboard and hands. So the results were as you'd pretty much expect. So in typing in the blind, word per minute and error rates were vastly inferior to the reality baseline, and this graph kind of shows the, what was happening there. So this is mapping the duration to key press and the accuracy of the very first key press of every phrase across all the users. And what you can see is that in the reality baseline, it takes the user about 2 seconds to reach out and hit the first key, and they're accurate most of the time. In comparison, the VR no blending condition, they take a similar amount of time, but they're wildly inaccurate in doing so. So what they were essentially doing is reaching out and pressing any key and then trying to orient themselves on the keyboard as appropriate. Whereas with the VR partial blending and VR full blending conditions, the accuracy comes back up, albeit they take slightly longer. I mean, we attribute that to the latencies involved of rendering. So what did this tell us? Well, it validated our system as being a significant improvement. It demonstrated, in a very basic way, a need for a view of reality when interacting with peripherals, and it showed that there was no difference in terms of performance between our partial and full blending conditions. So we've kind of quantified how well users can interact with reality, and we've kind of improved their capability to interact, but there are still some open questions. So what effect does bringing reality into VR have on your sense of presence in the VR simulation you're in? Does this effect vary with respect to the amount of reality that you bring in? And when do we bring reality into the VR simulation? And this led on to our second study, interaction with objects. So for this, we gave users a gamepad and asked them to explore the Tuscany demo, which is a kind of common demo that comes with the Oculus Rift. And when prompted, we wanted them to interact as they normally would with one of 3 objects: our keyboard, just a kind of peripheral, a fake donut, a kind of easily manipulatable object, and a cup, an object with an actual kind of orientation to it. And while doing so, we were going to manipulate 2 factors. So the blending of reality with VR and control. So in terms of blending, we again had no blending. So this is where you had no view of reality. So you see me feeling around trying to find a cup. And then we had the minimal blending, which employed a torchlight metaphor, so you can see the reality around the hand. Partial blending, so this is when you could see all the available interactive objects. And appears to be unsuccessfully collecting water. And full blending, so this is where you can see the full view of reality. Now, it doesn't look like the full view of reality here, but it took up the majority of the field of view of the Oculus Rift when rendered. So in terms of control, we had user control. This is when we gave the user explicit control over when to bring reality in by pressing a button on the controller pad. Or we had inferred engagement, meaning when the user reached out to interact with an object, the object was brought into view. And for our purposes, we refer to engagement in terms of the user's attention and involvement with the object. So for our measures here, we were looking at sense of presence, and we used the IPQ questionnaire for that. Workload, ranking, and distraction from VR due to reality. And what we found was that there was a significant effect on both the blending factor and control factor. So we found that there was a difference between minimal and partial blending compared to full blending, and that they better preserved users' sense of presence. And we found there was effect in terms of controls. So the inferred engagement approach also helped to preserve sense of presence better than giving the user explicit control over when to bring in reality. I should point out on the side as well, the always on and lift headset to peak conditions were baselines. Always on meaning you keep the headset on at all times. Lift headset to peak meaning they were allowed to lift the headset off to see what object was there. So these results were mirrored in many of the other parts that we looked at. So for example, distraction, you can see minimal and partial inferred blending was superior here. In terms of ranking, users vastly preferred it as well. So what did we learn from this? Well, any blending is better than no blending. And I'll go back to the ranking to point this out. So you can see that even the full blending conditions are still significantly preferred to having either the headset always on and interacting without a view of reality, or having to lift the headset in order to interact with reality. However, selectively incorporating the necessary elements of reality is better, and inferring engagement with reality is important. So we've quantified vaguely how we can interact with reality. We've potentially improved their ability to interact with reality. Can we improve their awareness of reality? And by that I mean, can we improve their awareness of the proximate persons that are around them? So we saw it as being a logical extension to our engagement approach that we could have a partial blending condition for awareness. So here you can see we are partially blending silhouettes of proximate users and incorporating them to VR in approximately the same spatial position as they are in real life. But there's a problem with people. With objects, you know where the objects are, so you can choose to engage with them or not. With people, people are transient. They come in, they leave the room, they move around. And so if we're going to have an engagement-based approach, you need to have some base level of awareness of who is there before you can potentially choose to engage with them. So the question then was, well, how do we unobtrusively communicate presence and proximity so users can choose to engage? And we had the idea of having a kind of ghost-like presence. So you have this transparent figure, and you have a vague idea of who it is, where they are in the room, and then if you chose to engage, we might move to the high engagement state of the full blending. And for this, we were looking at a reality baseline again in order to see your baseline sense of presence, and then fixed engagement, low engagement, and high engagement conditions. And the experimenter would enter the room repeatedly during the condition, while users explored the Tuscany demo once more. Our measures, again, sense of presence, distraction, and a new one, social presence from the temple presence inventory, and that allowed us to gauge the extent to which they could recognize what the person was doing and who it was. And what we found was, well, awareness improved as you would expect. So with a more view of reality, you have more awareness. However, there was a problem with this, and that was that the low engagement state, the kind of ghost-like vision, was almost as distracting as high engagement state. Which is not ideal. We wanted something that was less distracting, less obtrusive, but communicated some awareness. And participant interviews suggested that we should perhaps incorporate non-visual representations of proximity in existence. So for example, using tactile or audio cues, or potentially using abstract visual approaches as well, so perhaps textual notifications to inform you when someone enters the room, so you could then choose to engage with them later if you so wished. And interestingly as well, there was no significant effects in sense of presence, and in fact some factors, for example spatial presence, increased in the low and high engagement states. And this suggests that when the view is in line with user expectations, that it reinforces their sense of presence there. So if you're in a Tuscan villa and real people are wandering around in the villa, it makes you feel like you're in a Tuscan villa. So trying to bring all this together, here we've got Milgram's reality virtuality continuum. And you can see in our blending approaches that we're transitioning across the reality virtuality continuum as we incorporate more of reality into virtuality. And in terms of our engagement-dependent approach, this suggests that, well, where the incorporated reality detracts from the VR experience, we can handle transitions across the mixed reality continuum based on engagement. And why would we do this? Well, this minimizes the size of the transition, so we're incorporating only the amount of reality necessary based on the user's engagement, and it helps the user to manage the presence of reality. Now, in terms of awareness, well, we need a low engagement state, we need a default state. With objects, we could default to going straight back to the virtual environment. With users, we need this low awareness state, and we don't quite know what that would be yet. We'd suggest abstract cues or other modalities. I think that's kind of interesting future work to look at. There are also some questions. Well, are transitions even necessary? So if the incorporated reality matches the VR context, well, perhaps not. Alternatively, you could modify the appearance of reality to match the context. So, for example, taking the keyboard and rendering some new view over the keyboard to make it match the context of a Tuscan villa or whatever virtual scene you're in. And then there's the question of how we measure engagement. And this is very context specific. So in terms of interaction with objects, we were kind of using a proximity approach. You could also use hand pose or gaze. In terms of interaction with and awareness of others, voice and gaze would be entirely likely. But with interaction with others, there's also the issue of, well, engagement can be bidirectional. So the VR user can be choosing to say hello to someone that's entered the room. Equally, someone could enter the room and try and catch the attention of the VR user. And the system should perhaps respond appropriately to that and elevate the VR user to a higher engagement state. And why does all this matter? Well, not incorporating reality introduces a great deal of constraints into the VR experience. You've got no awareness of others, you're impaired when interacting with peripherals, and there's a lack of modalities. And we would suggest that we need some common mechanisms and guidelines for incorporating reality into VR experiences. And engagement-dependent augmented virtuality, which is what we're referring to this as, provides an approach to potentially doing this. Thank you, and I'd just like to point out the code samples and more survey data will be available in that URL. Thank you very much.